Dr. Lucas had always been fascinated by local history, and his new position as a literature teacher in a small town seemed like the perfect opportunity to explore that interest. When he learned that the old school was closed and that few had set foot inside in recent years, his curiosity led him to schedule a visit. He figured he might find something interesting to share with his students, perhaps a piece of forgotten history. The school, an imposing and decaying building, looked as if it had been suddenly abandoned. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the broken windows, and the sound of his own footsteps echoed through the desolate hallways. The classrooms were covered in dust, and the furniture, covered in cobwebs, looked as if it had been left in the middle of a lesson. As he entered one of the classrooms, Dr. Lucas noticed something strange on a table in the corner. A notebook, which appeared relatively intact, sat on the table, next to an old bench. The notebook was bound in leather, with an antique look that was appealing both for its integrity and its solemn nature. He hesitated for a moment, studying the notebook as if he expected it to reveal some secret. Curiosity piqued, Dr. Lucas approached and opened the notebook. The first few pages were covered with hand-drawn notes and illustrations. The letters were written in a shaky, childlike handwriting, but the contents were disturbing. Accounts of strange events and dark fears were described in vivid detail. There were drawings of sinister shadows and distorted figures that seemed to come to life in the soft light that filtered through the window. As Dr. Lucas leafed through the notebook, he felt a growing sense of unease. It was as if he were being watched, as if the notebook itself was waiting for his reaction. He left the room with the notebook in hand, determined to investigate more about the student who had written it, unaware that his curiosity would lead him down a much darker path. Back in his office, Dr. Lucas began to examine the notebook more closely. He sat at his desk, the room silent except for the occasional sound of pages turning. As he delved deeper into the notes, his initial uneasiness turned to a palpable unease. The notebook seemed to contain the student's deepest fears, each page a disturbing glimpse into a tormented mind. The reports were of a strange shadow that seemed to follow the student everywhere he went. Descriptions of unexplained events became more and more frequent. Doors that closed on their own, inaudible whispers, and a constant feeling of being watched. The shaky writing reflected a growing paranoia and despair. The illustrations alongside the texts were particularly disturbing, showing a shadow that slithered into every corner of the classroom, almost as if it were moving from page to page. As the evening wore on, Dr. Lucas began to experience a growing sense of unease. The shadows in his office seemed to stretch and twist in strange ways, and the sound of the wind outside the windows seemed to carry whispers he couldn't quite identify. He tried to focus on the notebook, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The notebook, which had once seemed like a harmless curiosity, now felt like a portal to something much more sinister. Dr. Lucas tried to rationalize what he was feeling, telling himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He knew the notebook was merely a testament to a troubled mind, and that he shouldn't let it affect his sanity. However, the feeling that something was wrong continued to grow. He decided to close the notebook and leave it in his drawer, thinking that perhaps a night's rest would help him regain clarity. As he prepared for bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that the notebook was waiting for him, and that the fears described in its pages were manifesting themselves in his own reality. What was supposed to be a simple curiosity was beginning to turn into something much deeper and more disturbing. In the days that followed, Dr. Lucas realized that the notebook had left a deeper mark on his life than he had imagined. The feeling of unease he had experienced on the first night did not go away, and the disturbing events began to intensify. As he prepared his lectures, Dr. Lucas noticed small details that began to unsettle him. The shadows in his office seemed to move with a life of their own, and small objects would be found out of place. He would often find his notebook open to specific pages, as if it were being read by someone unseen. Each time he tried to return to the notebook, the words and illustrations seemed to take on new meaning, intensifying the fear he felt. The nights were particularly difficult. Dr. Lucas would begin to dream of the shadows and figures described in the notebook. In his dreams, he was in a dark classroom, surrounded by the same shadows that the student had described. The feeling of claustrophobia and fear was so real that when he woke up, he was sweating and panting, certain that something was wrong. The notebook seemed to have the ability to shape his reality, and the fear described in the pages seemed to be infiltrating his own life. Dr. Lucas tried to find a logical explanation for the events. He consulted books on the paranormal and researched the missing student, but nothing seemed to offer a satisfactory answer. His colleagues and students noticed his strange and worried behavior, but he struggled to maintain a normal facade. Internally, he struggled with the feeling that reality and the supernatural were intertwining in disconcerting ways. The tension reached its peak on one particularly unsettling night. Dr. Lucas heard whispering sounds coming from the notebook, which was open on his desk. When he approached to investigate, the shadows around him seemed to stir, and he saw a vague figure moving in the darkness. The fear and the feeling that he was being watched became unbearable. Desperately, he closed the notebook and tried to shake off the feeling of terror, but the heavy atmosphere persisted. Dr. Lucas knew that something was deeply wrong, and the line between reality and the manifestation of the student's fears was blurring. The notebook, which had begun as an academic curiosity, had now become a constant threat, and the fear described in its pages was becoming an unsettling part of his own life. The following night, Dr. Lucas was determined to face head-on what the notebook was doing to his life. He knew he had to understand the source of the terror and, if possible, confront it. Armed with a flashlight and a courage he tried to convince himself he still possessed, he returned to the decommissioned school. The atmosphere in the school was even more oppressive than before. The beam of the flashlight wavered and created dancing shadows on the walls, which seemed to move in strange ways. Dr. Lucas felt a weight on his chest, a growing sense that something was approaching. He made his way to the classroom where he had found the notebook, determined to investigate further. As he entered the room, the temperature seemed to have dropped abruptly. Dr. Lucas noticed that the notebook was back on the desk, open to the same page as before. He hesitated for a moment before approaching and reading the last entry, which seemed to have been written with desperate urgency. The words described an encounter with an evil entity that fed on fear and captured its victims, dragging them into a dimension of eternal terror. The reading was almost unbearable. As he read, the lights in the room began to flicker and the flashlight flickered, as if an invisible force was trying to interrupt his reading. Suddenly, the environment around him began to change. The walls of the classroom seemed to stretch and distort, and the floor became uneven, creating a confusing maze. Dr. Lucas felt an ominous presence behind him. Turning, he saw a dense, distorted shadow forming in the corner of the room. The shadow appeared to be humanoid in shape, but with grotesque, mutated features. Its contours were indistinct, and it seemed as if the shadow itself was alive, moving independently. The entity advanced towards him, and Dr. Lucas felt a wave of icy terror invade his body. He tried to flee, but the maze of shadows seemed to close in around him, making every movement more difficult. The entity seemed to enjoy his panic, getting closer and closer, until he felt the cold and disgusting touch of the shadows on his skin. Desperately, Dr. Lucas remembered the description in the notebook of how the entity fed on fear. He tried to gather all his courage and screamed, trying to defy it and show that he was no longer terrified. With a final effort, he managed to escape the room, running through the dark corridors of the school until he found the exit. The entity seemed to have retreated, but the terror was still present, like a shadow that never completely disappears. Dr. Lucas returned home, exhausted and scarred by the terrifying experience. He was shaken, his mind still processing what he had experienced. The experience at the decommissioned school had left an indelible mark on his psyche. He knew he had escaped the entity, but he felt that the shadow of terror continued to loom over him. In the days that followed, Dr. Lucas tried to return to his normal routine, but the feeling of restlessness did not go away. The nights were particularly difficult, with disturbing dreams and the constant feeling that something was watching him. He knew he needed to deal with the notebook, but he was unsure how. Determined to stop the notebook from causing any more damage, Dr. Lucas returned to the school, hoping to find some solution. However, upon arriving, he discovered that the classroom where he had found the notebook was completely empty. The notebook had disappeared, and there were no signs of its previous presence. He searched the school, but the feeling that something was following him would not leave him alone. In desperation, he tried to alert the local authorities, but when investigations were carried out, they found nothing out of the ordinary. The notebook seemed to have disappeared, and the story of the missing student had become an unsolvable enigma. Dr. Lucas felt a sense of helplessness and frustration. As he drove home, he realized that the impact of the experience continued to affect him. The feeling that the entity was still lurking would not leave him. He reflected on the notebook and the way it had exposed his deepest fears, and how it had influenced his own reality. The story of the missing student now seemed to be a warning, a reminder that fear can manifest itself in unimaginable ways. Dr. Lucas's final scene was of a man changed by the experience, with the notebook mysteriously reappearing in a new classroom, suggesting that the cycle of terror was far from over. The sense that the terror had found a new target was palpable, and the story seemed ready to begin again. Dr. Lucas looked at the deactivated school one last time, knowing that the notebook and the entity might have found a new victim. He walked away, taking with him the certainty that the terror described in the pages was not just a story, but a reality that could touch anyone who got too close.